Snow fell like powdered glass over the ruins of Bavaria, muting the last growls of a dying war. In January 1945, the land seemed frozen between worlds, one collapsing, another not yet born. The wind carried no words now, only the creak of broken shutters and the occasional echo of artillery in the distance, too faint to tell which side still fired. Fields that once fed whole villages were now pocked with shell holes, their barns burned to skeleton frames. The Third Reich's banners had been reduced to ash, yet the people beneath them were still trapped, by hunger, by fear, by a silence thicker than smoke. A column of the U.S. Army's 4th Armored Division cut its way through this silence. Their tanks groaned like old beasts as they climbed the icy road toward Deggendorf, treads crushing the snow into steam. The men inside were worn thin by too many towns that looked the same. Church spires snapped in half, windows stuffed with rags, faces that didn't dare wave. For months they'd fought from Luxembourg through the Saar, liberated camps, crossed rivers under fire. They'd seen men buried in ice and villages turned to shadows. But none of that prepared them for the strange emptiness ahead. Lieutenant Warren Boyd rode in the lead jeep, his breath fogging against the cracked windshield. 28, tall, from Kansas, he'd once taught history before the war took that privilege from him. His men called him Schoolhouse, because he never swore when the shells fell. Now he watched the horizon like a man reading a book whose next page might explode. The map said there was a town ahead. The land said otherwise. Dead place, muttered Corporal Ruiz beside him, rubbing his hands. Not even a crow left. Boyd nodded but said nothing. His eyes followed a narrow trail veering off the main road, 2 ruts frozen solid, leading toward a ridge where a manor's roof barely showed through skeletal trees. He felt something pull there. Maybe it was instinct, or just fatigue turning curiosity into command. "Take us up that way," he said quietly. The column hesitated. A half-dozen tanks idled in a line behind, their engines rumbling like restless animals. Sergeant Dent leaned from his Sherman's hatch. "Sir, that's off-grid. We're supposed to reach Deggendorf before nightfall." Boyd's answer came calm, almost weary. "If there's smoke, there's someone alive. And if not, maybe we can still find out why." The manor came into view as the snow thickened. Its roof sagged inward, shutters nailed shut. Faint marks on the doorframe, hands, maybe, had been frozen into ice. The men spread out, rifles slung low. A dog barked somewhere far off, then went quiet. No movement inside. No footprints leading out. Just the soft hum of wind curling through broken glass. Ruiz kicked at a pile of ashes near the step. "Cold for weeks. Whoever lived here's long gone." Boyd crouched and brushed the snow aside. Underneath lay a small wooden cross, roughly carved, the initials barely visible. KL, a child's grave, maybe. The lieutenant stood slowly, jaw tight. He'd seen graves on both sides of the war, but something about this one, alone, half-buried, felt heavier than most. They split into teams. 2 men circled the back, prying open a warped kitchen door. Inside, the air was stale, sour with decay. Chairs overturned, floor covered with frozen potatoes and a toppled water bucket. A child's shoe lay beside a stove stuffed with damp ashes. Every sound echoed like a confession. "Sir," called Private Everett from the hall. "You'll want to see this." Boyd stepped into a narrow corridor where faded wallpaper peeled in long strips. Everett pointed to a locked cellar door, thick oak, reinforced from the outside. Someone had nailed it shut. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. In war, cellars meant many things: ambushes, weapons caches, or worse. Boyd raised his hand, signaling quiet. The only sound was the drip of melting frost. Then, faintly, something else, a whimper, so soft it could have been the wind. He pressed his ear against the door. The sound came again, definitely human, weak and tremulous, like breath against glass. Boyd motioned to Ruiz, who took a crowbar and pried at the nails. One by one they gave, the noise sharp in the still air. When the last hinge creaked, a sour, musty odor rolled out, mildew, urine, unwashed skin. Flashlights cut through the dark. The beams fell on faces. Dozens of them. Pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed, blinking at the light like creatures from another world. Women mostly, bundled in threadbare coat. An old man in a wheelchair. A girl missing an arm. They huddled together on straw mats, too weak to move. When the first soldier stepped closer, a few cried out, shielding their faces. Others just stared in disbelief. Boyd froze. His hand trembled on the flashlight. These weren't prisoners. They were civilians. German civilians. The old man tried to speak, but his voice cracked, a rasp of thirst. Ruiz lowered his rifle, pulling a canteen from his belt. The man reached for it and wept before the water even touched his lip. "They've been locked in," Everett whispered, scanning the walls. "From the outside." Boyd swallowed hard. "How long?" The old man lifted shaking fingers. 5, then 6. Weeks, maybe more. The cellar was littered with ration tins, all empty. Someone had tried to burn chair legs for warmth. Near the corner, a woman with frostbitten feet clutched a rosary made from bread crumbs. Another lay still beside her, unmoving. The room smelled of slow death. The lieutenant turned away, jaw clenched. Outside, snow kept falling, indifferent. He'd seen soldiers die with dignity, enemies beg with hatred, but this was something different. This was what war did when no one was looking. Dent's voice came from the doorway. "Sir, radio's picking up chatter. Command wants us to push east. They say Deggendorf's priority." Boyd looked at the faces in front of him. He saw a woman no older than 30 staring back, lips cracked, eyes sunken yet defiant. She whispered something in German he half understood. "Nicht Feind, nicht mehr." Not enemies, not anymore. He exhaled slowly. "Tell command we found survivors. We're not moving till they're safe." Dent hesitated. Orders were orders. But something in Boyd's tone, quiet, unshakable, ended the argument. The sergeant nodded. "Yes, sir." The men moved quickly after that. Blankets from trucks. Rations divided. Firewood scavenged from broken fences. Soon, thin trails of smoke began to curl from the manor's chimney. The air filled with the smell of burning pine and warm chocolate, two things no one there had tasted in months. For the first time, the faces in the cellar softened. Some smiled faintly through tears. A child laughed when Ruiz handed him half a biscuit, the sound startling everyone like a forgotten language returning. Boyd stepped outside, snow melting on his cap. The valley below was silent, white, endless. Somewhere beyond it, the war still raged, but here, just for a night, it had paused. He watched the smoke rise into the gray sky and thought, not of victory, but of survival, of the fragile bridge between enemy and human being. Then came a distant echo, gunfire, faint but growing. The front was moving again. The men turned their heads toward the sound. Boyd didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the manor, on the flicker of life rekindled inside. "Get some rest," he murmured to no one in particular. "Tomorrow we'll need it." But even he knew the war wasn't done with them yet. Dawn crept over the Bavarian hills like a hesitant hand, pale light seeping through the fog that clung to the valley. The manor that had seemed so empty the night before now stirred with faint signs of life, thin curls of smoke from the chimney, a soft cough echoing in the corridor, boots crunching on the frozen gravel outside. Inside, the air had shifted from deathly stillness to fragile noise. The rustle of blankets, the creak of old beams, the trembling voices of people remembering how to speak. Lieutenant Boyd stood by the entryway, coat unbuttoned, steam rising from his breath. He watched Ruiz pour hot water into a mess tin, dissolving powdered cocoa that smelled faintly of childhood. The first sip went to an old man in a wheelchair, his fingers shaking so hard he spilled half of it on his lap. He didn't seem to care. His eyes, clouded but alive, fixed on Boyd with a gratitude too large for words. They'd spent the night clearing rooms, dragging out the dead, stacking broken furniture by the door. The cellar had become a ward, its air heavy with smoke and whispers. A few of the women could still walk. Others lay wrapped in wool blankets, faces as thin as parchment. A young German woman with a burned scar along her neck helped Ruiz hand out rations. Her name, they learned, was Irma. 24. Once a nurse in Munich, she'd fled with the disabled patients when the hospital was bombed. When the roads closed, they hid here. Boyd tried to ask how long they'd been trapped. She counted weeks with her fingers, pausing halfway through as if memory itself hurt. "We waited," she said softly in halting English. "But no one came. Not Germans. Not anyone." The words landed like stones in the silence. Outside, the frost still clung to the trucks. Private Everett and Sergeant Dent were arguing by the gate. Dent wanted to move, orders were clear. Their fuel was running low, the battalion advancing east. Everett kept glancing back at the manor. "Sir," he said when Boyd stepped out, "they won't make it if we leave. Half of them can't walk. The medics won't be here for days." Boyd stared down the empty road, where the fog swallowed everything. Command wouldn't wait. But what kind of victory meant abandoning the people who'd stopped being enemies overnight? He thought of his students back in Kansas, how he used to teach them about justice as something clean, rational. War had burned that illusion to ash. "Pull the rations from truck 2, he said quietly, "and tear up the floorboards in the pantry for firewood. We stay till they can stand." Dent's jaw tightened. "That's against orders." Boyd met his eyes. "So is mercy." By noon, the house smelled of life again. Wood smoke, cocoa, boiled potatoes. The soldiers worked without complaint now, their faces changing with every hour they spent among the civilians. Ruiz carried an old woman up the stairs as gently as if she were made of glass. Everett found a violin in a wardrobe and spent the afternoon tuning its cracked strings. Its first notes were broken, but they made people smile. Even Dent, the last to soften, began wrapping bandages with Irma by the window, his rough hands clumsy but kind. The snow outside melted into slush under their boot. For a moment, it felt as if the war had retreated beyond the hills. In the main hall, Boyd crouched beside a boy of perhaps 10, pale and silent, one leg gone below the knee. The child hadn't spoken since they found him. Boyd held out a chocolate bar. The boy only stared, suspicion flickering in his hollow eyes. When Boyd placed the chocolate in his hand and stepped back, the boy sniffed it, hesitated, then bit a corner, and began to cry. Not from hunger, Boyd realized, but from the shock of kindness itself. Irma approached, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "He thinks you are here to take him away," she murmured. "Soldiers came before. They said they would move us to another place, but they locked the doors instead." Boyd's expression didn't change, but his grip on the railing tightened until his knuckles went white. He looked around the dim hall, the boarded windows, the barricaded cellar, the marks of desperate hands on the door. They hadn't been trapped by the chaos of war. Someone had left them here deliberately. That realization hit like a bullet without sound. By evening, the manor glowed with lantern light. The civilians slept in clusters by the fire while the soldiers kept watch, rifles leaning unused against the wall. Outside, the valley had gone still again. The world beyond those trees was still killing itself, but within the stone walls there was something almost sacred, a fragile ceasefire between former enemies, bound by necessity and something older than nations. Ruiz came in from the cold, snow dusting his shoulders. "Lieutenant," he said, "found something out back." Boyd followed him through the corridor and into the courtyard. Ruiz pointed to a half-collapsed shed. Inside, buried under straw, were half a dozen crates marked with faded German script. Verpflegung, Notration. Emergency rations. Enough to feed everyone for weeks, if someone had opened them. Boyd's throat tightened. The lock had been smashed, but the contents were untouched. The civilians hadn't known. They'd starved inches from salvation. Ruiz exhaled. Guess whoever left them here wanted it quiet. Boyd didn't answer. He stared at the crates for a long moment, the snow falling on his cap, before finally saying, "Get them inside. No one tells the civilians how close they were to dying. Not tonight." Inside the manor, Irma and the others stirred as food and warmth returned. Boyd stood by the fire, the light flickering over his face. He thought of the irony. The American tanks that had flattened towns now saving the people who once cheered for those towns' destruction. He wondered if any of this made sense to history, or if history even cared. As night deepened, a soft sound rose, a hymn, whispered in German, sung by a few of the women. The soldiers didn't understand the words, but the melody carried something universal. The sound of mourning turned into prayer. Dent, half asleep by the door, muttered, "Never thought I'd see Kraut singing hymns while we stand guard." Ruiz gave a tired grin. "Maybe that's what winning looks like, Sarge." Boyd didn't smile. He looked toward the cellar, where the dead still lay under blankets. "No," he said softly. "That's what surviving looks like." The fire crackled. Snow pressed against the windows like ghosts trying to look in. From the road came a faint hum, the low growl of engines. The men froze. Boyd stepped to the window. Headlights flickered between the trees. "Not theirs. Not this far north." Ruiz whispered, "You think it's Germans?" Boyd's answer was quiet, steady, the same tone he used before every unknown. "We'll find out soon enough." The firelight trembled across the faces of the rescued, the fragile peace they'd built now hanging in the air like breath before a storm. Morning broke pale and trembling over the Bavarian countryside, the frost glinting like broken glass across the fields. The manor stood hunched against the cold, its chimneys breathing smoke for the first time in months. The air smelled of life again, of boiled potatoes, cocoa, and damp wool. For a few brief hours, the world beyond the valley seemed to disappear. The war was still out there, yes, but here, in this forgotten place, something had begun to thaw. Lieutenant Boyd walked the corridor quietly, his boots thudding against the warped floorboard. The rescued civilians still lay scattered across the rooms, a mosaic of suffering and survival. Some slept like the dead, others stirred weakly, clutching tin cups of thin broth. Near the fire, Irma knelt beside an elderly woman, spooning warm water into her mouth with patience that broke the heart to watch. She had been awake all night, her hands blistered from tending the fires. When Boyd offered to relieve her, she shook her head. "They have forgotten kindness," she whispered, eyes glistening. "We must teach it again." Outside, the snow was giving way to a slush of mud and melted ice. Private Everett stood by the jeep, fiddling with the radio. The line to command was faint and crackling, carrying orders that sounded colder than the wind. "Continue east. Do not engage. Prioritize fuel." He turned the dial down before the others could hear. How could he explain that they were being told to leave behind people who'd only just begun to believe in salvation? Inside, Boyd gathered the men. Ruiz leaned against the wall, exhausted but alert. Dent stood near the window, his hands tight on his belt. The lieutenant's voice was calm, low, but it carried through the room. "Medics are delayed. We're out of K-rations by nightfall. We can't stay much longer without help." He paused, glancing toward the sleeping figures. "But we're not leaving them to die." Dent frowned. "Sir, they're not our responsibility. We've got orders." "Orders change," Boyd interrupted softly. "Lives don't." The sergeant didn't answer, but his jaw loosened. There were no arguments left that didn't sound cruel when spoken aloud. That afternoon, the soldiers went into the nearby woods to cut firewood and search the farmhouses. They found a handful of chickens half frozen in a coop, a few sacks of flour, and one terrified farmer who'd been hiding from both armies for weeks. When Boyd offered him cigarettes for a cow and promised not to report him, the man stared in disbelief, then whispered, "Americaners sinned Cain Tier. The Americans are not animals." Back at the manor, Irma had set up a crude infirmary using beds dragged from upstairs. The boy with one leg, Otto, was awake now, watching the soldiers move through the halls. When Ruiz knelt to hand him a new bandage, the boy muttered, "You killed my father." Ruiz didn't flinch. He wrapped the wound slowly and said, "Maybe I did. Maybe someone like me did. But that's why I'm helping you now." Otto stared for a moment, then nodded and whispered, "Danke?" By evening, warmth returned to the walls. The soldiers and civilians shared one fire, no longer separated by fear. Irma translated as best she could, and laughter, awkward, brittle, but real, broke through the gloom. Boyd listened from the corner, writing in his notebook. His handwriting trembled. "We are surrounded by ghosts," he wrote, "but they are learning to live again." Then came the smell. A sour, unmistakable rot seeping from the cellar. Everett was the first to notice. When they pulled away the blankets, they found the bodies of those who hadn't survived the winter, 4 women, 1 man, all skeletal. Someone had laid them side by side, covered with old coats, a rosary between their hands. Irma's composure shattered. She pressed her face into her palms, sobbing quietly. Boyd knelt beside her, touching her shoulder lightly. "They died waiting," she said through tears. "Waiting for anyone. For someone who would open the door." The silence that followed felt heavier than the air itself. Boyd looked at the soldiers around him, their expressions caught between sorrow and rage. He could see it in their faces, the slow realization that this wasn't a war of nations anymore. It was a war of decency against indifference. That night, the manor became a sanctuary in defiance of orders. The men carried the dead out under the stars, the snow glowing faintly in moonlight. They dug graves behind the chapel ruins and buried them in silence. Ruiz whispered a prayer in Spanish. Irma whispered one in German. 2 languages, same plea. When they returned inside, the fire was burning low. Boyd poured the last of the cocoa into a tin mug and sat beside Irma. "We'll have more supplies soon," he said, though he wasn't sure. "You'll see spring again." She looked at him for a long time. "Do you believe that, Lieutenant?" He hesitated. "I have to." From outside came the rumble of an engine, a single truck, far off on the frozen road. The men froze, glancing toward the door. Ruiz grabbed his rifle, but Boyd raised a hand. "Wait." Headlights flickered through the trees, growing brighter. Then a voice shouted in English, "4th Division Medical Convoy." Cheers erupted. Relief, sharp and sudden, cut through the exhaustion. The medics arrived with supplies, bandages, quinine, blankets. Within hours, the manor was humming with activity again, soldiers and civilians working side by side under lantern light. The wounded were treated, the weakest fed first. Irma helped organize the lines, her voice firm, her strength returning. For the first time, Boyd allowed himself to step outside alone. The sky above was streaked with stars, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet earth. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind. Down in the valley, he could hear faint church bells from a village that still survived. He thought of how many places like this must exist, manors, barns, basements, filled with people too weak to be heard. How many would die before someone opened the door? The thought cut deeper than any order or victory. Inside, the boy Otto was playing softly with a soldier's harmonica, the tune fragile but hopeful. The sound carried through the open window, blending with the crackle of fire. Boyd smiled faintly, eyes glistening in the cold. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. Then a burst of static from the radio broke the spell. Everett's voice called from inside, tense and clip. "Lieutenant, you'd better hear this." Boyd crushed the cigarette under his boot and stepped back into the manor, the warmth striking his face. Everett turned the radio toward him. The voice on the other end was command, urgent, metallic, final. "All units, advance east immediately. Enemy movement detected near Deggendorf. Leave non-combatants. Repeat, leave non-combatants." Boyd's hand tightened on the table edge. Around him, the rescued civilians were settling to sleep, their breaths shallow but peaceful. Irma glanced at him from across the room, her expression questioning. He looked at her, then at the fire. The words came quietly, almost to himself. "We opened one door," he said. "I'll be damned if we close it again," he said. "I'll be damned if we close it again." Spring arrived not with joy but with disbelief. The snows receded slowly, uncovering fields littered with broken wagons, helmets, and bones. Birds returned to the valleys as if nothing had happened, but for those who had survived the long winter inside the Deggendorf manor, the thaw only deepened the silence. War was ending, yes, but the echoes would not stop. Lieutenant Boyd stood at the edge of the courtyard, boots sinking into thawing mud. Behind him, the manor was alive with the clatter of movement, voices, laughter, hammers patching walls. A month had passed since the rescue. The civilians were stronger now, walking again, faces no longer skeletal. The soldiers who had stayed behind, against orders, had become their caretakers, carpenters, even friends. For the first time in years, both sides spoke the same language without needing to understand it. Survival. Irma came outside carrying a bucket of water. Her hair was tied back now, her face still thin but radiant with life. She smiled faintly when Boyd turned. "You're leaving soon," she said. It wasn't a question. He hesitated. Command had finally caught up with them. A messenger had arrived the day before, a tired young officer who saluted and handed over a folded order sheet without looking up. The war was ending. The 4th Armored Division was to advance into Czechoslovakia to secure surrender zones. "Yes," Boyd said finally. "Tomorrow." Irma set the bucket down. "They'll forget this place," she murmured. "The others, the generals, they will never know what happened here." Boyd's eyes softened. "Maybe that's the point. Some stories aren't for history books. They're for people." Inside, Ruiz was teaching the boy Otto how to whittle a piece of wood into something that resembled a horse. The child's laughter filled the hall, a sound so pure that even Sergeant Dent cracked a smile. Everett was fixing the Jeep's radio again, pretending not to listen as Irma hummed softly by the window. That afternoon, they held a burial for the last of the dead. The snow had melted enough for proper graves this time. The soldiers stood in silence beside the townspeople, their helmets in hand. Irma read a verse from a tattered Bible she'd found among the ruins. Her voice wavered, but no one interrupted. When she finished, the old man in the wheelchair, who had barely spoken in weeks, reached out to shake Boyd's hand. His grip was weak, but his words were firm. "Sie haben uns nicht besiegt," he said quietly. "You did not defeat us. You saved us." Boyd felt something inside him shift, a slow cracking of something inside him shift, a slow cracking of the armor built by years of orders and blood. He wanted to tell the old man that saving people had never been part of his mission, that mercy had no line item in a soldier's ledger. But he couldn't. The truth was simpler. He was grateful to have found something left of himself here. As evening fell, the manor glowed again with firelight. The medics had moved on, leaving behind crates of supplies and the faint smell of disinfectant. The civilians were preparing to return to what remained of their villages, though many had nothing left to go to. Irma sat with Boyd near the hearth, both silent for a long time. "When I was a nurse," she said finally, "I saw men die for an idea. Then I saw them die because someone told them to. I thought the world was made of monsters. But maybe it is only made of people, some lost, some found." Boyd studied the flames. "War doesn't change people. It just shows what they already were." She nodded, her eyes shimmering. "Then you were always kind." He almost laughed at that. Kindness felt like a word from another century. "Still," he said, "maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of being cruel." Outside, a warm wind swept through the valley. The snow line retreated further each day, revealing green shoots breaking through the soil, fragile but defiant. Boyd watched them through the window and thought of how many places like this still lay hidden, waiting for someone to open a door. Later that night, after most had fallen asleep, the lieutenant gathered his men in the main hall. "We move at dawn," he said quietly. "No goodbyes. Just clean up what we can and leave it as we found it." Ruiz frowned. "We can't just walk away, sir." Boyd's gaze drifted toward the sleeping civilians. "We're not walking away. We're giving them back their silence. They've earned it." When dawn came, it came soft and gold. The convoy was small, 2 jeeps, a truck, a handful of weary men. The villagers gathered in the courtyard to see them off. Irma stood at the front, holding Otto's hand. She looked at Boyd as if memorizing every line of his face. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. Instead, he simply nodded. She stepped forward and placed a small linen bundle in his hand. Inside was a wooden carving, the horse Otto had made. "For remembrance," she said. "So you will not think we were only shadows." He tucked it into his coat pocket. "You were never shadows." As the engines rumbled to life, the civilians waved, some smiling, some weeping. The soldiers waved back until the manor disappeared behind the trees. No one spoke for miles. The air was too full of ghosts. By noon, they reached the outskirts of Deggendorf. The roads were packed with refugees, carts, and the occasional wandering soldier from a war that didn't know it was over. The Americans distributed food where they could. One woman, gaunt and barefoot, saw the U.S. insignia on Boyd's sleeve and fell to her knees, sobbing. He lifted her gently to her feet. "It's over," he told her. "Go home." But even as he said it, he knew many no longer had homes to return to. That night, in a field camp east of the town, Boyd sat by the fire writing his final report. His handwriting was steady now. Found approximately 40 civilians, including disabled and elderly. Provided rations, shelter, medical care. Enemy hostilities minimal. Morale restored. He paused, staring at the paper. Then he added one last line. Acts of humanity witnessed amid ruin. Recommend full investigation of local abandonment. He signed it and folded it away. Around him, the soldiers talked quietly, passing a bottle between them. The stars overhead were sharp and cold. For the first time since the Ardennes, Boyd allowed himself to feel proud, not of victory, but of decency. He reached into his pocket and turned the wooden horse over in his palm. Its surface was rough, unfinished, but it carried the warmth of many hands. Somewhere behind him, church bells rang faintly through the hills, distant, uneven, as if the land itself were learning how to breathe again. When Boyd looked up, he caught sight of Ruiz staring east, his expression unreadable. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Ruiz nodded toward the horizon. "Sir, do you think they'll remember?" Boyd considered the question. The fire crackled between them, sparks rising like lost prayers. "Maybe not their names," he said. "But the kindness, they'll remember that." He looked out into the darkness where the manor once stood, hidden beyond the hills, and for a moment imagined Irma lighting the hearth again, Otto laughing, the old man whispering prayers for both the living and the dead. The war was ending, but its quietest victories would never be written down. The night deepened, and a soft wind carried the smell of earth and ash. Boyd closed his eyes and whispered, almost to himself, "Not enemies. Not any more."